Hi, welcome all here, and those in person, those at home, and those who may check in later when this is when the recording is posted. Welcome to Sunday Forum. I'm just going to quickly introduce the DEIB group. That's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Sally Allison, Windsor Wade, and Grania Marcus have done a wonderful job of putting together this series today, next Sunday, and the following Sunday. So thank you, Sally. The mic is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I am here as the chair of the DEIB committee.
Perfect.
I got it right. Yay. I get an A. Whose full presentation I saw at the Gates Presbyterian Church earlier this year, which I really enjoyed and decided to ask him to come to talk with us. So as an introduction, Shane Wiegand is the co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at Coordinated Care Services Incorporated. Previously, he was a fourth grade teacher at the Rush Henrietta Central School District. He is also a board member at City Roots Community Land Trust and Connected Communities. For his work with the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, he was named as one of the Rochester Business Journal's 40 Under 40 in 2021. He and his wife live in the Beechwood neighborhood of Rochester. And so without further ado, Shane.
Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. Can folks hear me? Yeah. You can hear me? Okay, good. I'm not sure what's happening with the slides. Let's make sure this works. It clicks. No, it doesn't. Oh, it does. We have a victory. All right. Well, hold on. I was skipping ahead. You shouldn't have seen that slide. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? This is good with a microphone. Do I need to stand like this, or is this okay? Okay. So I'm Shane Wiegand. I was a fourth grade teacher for a number of years before taking my classroom and going into lots of others. I co-direct the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project with Keisha James right here, who is not with us this morning, but sends her best. Often we do these together. But we are both full-time out of our classrooms and in many others, sharing some of the local history from enslavement to redlining and civil rights. Today, though, I'm going to share some history about this church and how it connected with some of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And I'm really excited to tie a little bit of that into the story. What we're going to do today is a little different than what we do in fourth or eighth grade classrooms, but hopefully there'll be some new learning, some stuff that you already know, and some really good conversation. But I'm here most of all today because about 9 years ago, I had a fourth grader in my classroom say, "Mr. Wiegand, did Martin Luther King Jr. ever come to Rochester?" And it was one of those really special moments as an educator where you're like, yep, the kids are always smarter than you are. And I'm like, I had never thought to ask such a great question. Despite living here my entire life, I had no idea if Dr. King had come to Rochester, if we'd had a civil rights movement, if slavery had happened in this community. I realized I'd lived in Webster my entire life. I'd grown up going to Third Presbyterian Church. I had no idea. And so as I start thinking about this question, I invited the student to ask me to investigate with me if this had happened. And we went into the newspaper archives at the library and discovered that, of course, Martin Luther King had come to Rochester. He'd come twice. In 58 and 62, he'd stayed with Dr. Charles Lunsford, who'd integrated the Red Cross, who had fought housing segregation in the 19th Ward when 150 neighbors signed a petition to try to keep him from living in that neighborhood, Rochester's only Black physician. And I realized, how did I not know this? This was all happening at the exact same time my grandfather bought a house in Greece. Like, what was missing? And as I start telling these stories to my students, I met incredible folks in our communities, like Dr. Walter Cooper, people like Elizabeth Hampton, people like I don't know, Dr. Alice Holloway Young, and so many others, people like Nydia Padilla. I know Bora Quindance is here. And I also met some folks from your church like Wasa Bufavong, who I'm sure many of you know. And hopefully he'll be at church this morning. I'm excited to see him in Reina. And together we started writing curriculum, doing research, and raising some funding from local institutions who'd played a role in some of this history, like Eastman Savings and Loan, now ESL, and started sharing this curriculum across our community. We're in 16 school districts locally, all 6 schools of education at our local colleges, and also in several school districts across New York State, from Buffalo, Syracuse, Binghamton, Albany, Westchester, and Long Island. And I'm really, really excited to share a little of this history. And as we do this today, I'm going to do this just like I do with kids. That's kind of how we do it. But I also think it's really important that as we go through this, we check in. As we look at hard stuff, we remember how we're feeling, but we also have a little fun. And so here's what I'm going to invite you to do. If you can see these dogs on the screen, just to gauge on this Sunday morning, how are folks doing? Which dog or dog represents how you are feeling right now? Like, I'm a solid 4 dog, but I'm also a solid 1. It's been a long week. We're having a home renovation in our bathroom. It's not fun. I'm living with my in-laws right now. I'm in a dark place. So turn to the person next to you, if you would. Turn and talk and tell them which dog or dogs is how you're feeling, or close to how you're feeling right now. And introduce yourself if you don't know who's next to you. Go for it. Feeling some relief. Okay, and now's the part where I'm going to ask you to take a step farther. Show me with your fingers which dog or dogs is where you're at. So I'm a solid 4. How are we doing? Oh, we got some 4s. We got an 8. Oh, we're real tired back here. Hang in there. A 6, a 4. Oh, we're all 7, 6. We're doing pretty good. I think we're going to make it. Only 1 8. Be strong. All right. Everyone smile at folks that look like they need it. All right. So we're going to check in throughout a few other times as we look at these 3 questions. I don't have an answer to these 3 questions, but I have a lot of primary sources, some of my own thoughts, some of your ideas, stuff that you know that I don't know, but that hopefully together, as we talk together, as I share a little bit, we'll come closer to answering these 3 questions and thinking about what this could mean for us and this community. So as we go today, I want to invite you to consider what has prevented our community from being a welcoming and affirming place. How have people worked to build a more inclusive community over our history? And most importantly, how can we be a part of building a welcoming and affirming community here in Greater Rochester today? So as we go, I'll remind you those questions again, but we're going to take kind of a closer look. Everything I'm sharing today is not just what I thought was interesting or my own research. It comes from working with over 30 youth at Teen Empowerment, who actually interviewed quite a few elders in our community. Here are just 4 of them who were active participants in Rochester's civil rights movement. We were able to hire the youth to actually do the interviews and work with TE and help vet and write our curriculum. I also want to mention that we're here because of my 4th grade students. The girl in the middle, her name is Kaliat. She was really upset at one of the first years I taught this history. She'd learned about redlining for the first time. She learned about Dr. Alice Holloway Young, who later I'll share about how she fought the Ku Klux Klan, but also how she was the first Black principal in Monroe County in 1962. And Kaliat looked at her, and we actually had the chance to learn from Dr. Young, who's still with us. And she said, "Mr. Wiegand, this isn't fair. I really like you, but it's not fair that I've never had a teacher who looks like me." And I counted 50 teachers in our school, and every single one looks like you. And I think that's systemic racism. And I want to talk to Mr. Pollard, the principal, about it at lunch today. I panicked. And then I remembered I had tenure. I thought this will be okay. And then I thought, wait, what did Dr. Young do, Kaliat? And she's like, well, she had her friends helping her. And she said, oh, Bailey and Simra will help me. So we got parent permission. We took a couple weeks to research and make a list of demands. And here's a picture of the girls meeting with a principal. I'll tell you what happened at the end. But when these girls saw themselves in our community's history, they realized they needed to go together to make a difference. They had to figure out who to talk to, and they had to understand their history to do that. And it's my hope that we'll carry some of that forward and these girls' legacy forward as we go today. A little more about our project. We've got curriculum in grades 2 through 12 on the local history from enslavement to redlining to the Black freedom struggle and civil rights, and similar resources across the state. We've got a really great website that I'll email out afterwards to folks, or have Sally email out, where you can access all of our curriculum, which is free and open source that anyone can use, a documentary, and a whole host of other good stuff. If you walked in later, make sure you pick up a flyer. We're doing a free screening at the Little of July 64 about the uprising in Rochester, as well as our new film about redlining and racial covenants, both directed by Carvin Eisen, who some of you might know from RCTV. And it's going to be awesome, a panel. You're not going to want to miss it. I won't have time to show the film today, but you'll get to see it at the Little if you come. So I hope you do. All right, how we're going to do this today and how we do all our curriculum with kids is from a restorative standpoint. The goal is to understand more ourselves and one another. We're going to do it from a place of inquiry, where I'm going to invite you to notice, to wonder, to make your own conclusions, to feel how you feel. My goal is not to push my politics on you or to push what I think on you, but hopefully to share some sources, and together we'll draw some of our own conclusions about what this means, but ultimately with a bias towards action. This history is not just to know, it's to use and to do something with, like hundreds of kids across Monroe County are using this curriculum, and lots of adults. So again, as we dig into our 3 big questions, I'm going to show you an image, and I'm going to do this pretty quick. But I'm going to show you this quick image. I'm not going to show you the key, the title until the very end. In fact, I want you to not totally know what this is. You're supposed to be a little frustrated. And I'm going to invite you to take a second to look at this image, and then turn to the person next to you and just share, what are you noticing? What patterns do you see? What are you wondering? Sound good? This is one piece of 4 parts. Ready? So go ahead, turn to your neighbor. What are you noticing, wondering, or inferring about this image? And feel free to start talking as soon as you want.
Right. Oh, yeah, so. Right.
Take 5 more seconds. All right. Feel free to throw up a hand. Who's got something they're noticing or wondering? And if you've seen this before, don't be a stinker. Don't give it away. I'm looking at you. All right. What are we noticing or wondering? What do we got? Yes.
Wondering what the colors mean.
What do the colors mean? I heard back here you said, how about those red dots? How about you?
I've been color weak, so I can't pick up color differences. Population density.
That's a really good inference. I like that. Who else? Yeah.
It's mostly the eastern suburbs. I don't see.
Eastern suburbs and a little bit of the eastern half of Rochester. Okay. And for those who are color weak, I haven't heard, I like that. A lot of blue here. Does anyone see though, this spot right here? There's like a little pocket of green
Yes.
and red. Any thoughts about what that might be? Yeah,
Very good time.
Pines of Parrington. So could this have something to do with income? Yeah, maybe low income the colors have to do with. Go ahead, turn and talk with your neighbor. What are you noticing and wondering now? I'll give you a little bit more of the map. And there's no right or wrong answer. Take wild guesses at what these things could be. Could red be pollution hotspots? Oh, I like it.
Kodak, north of Kodak.
Is that Kodak or maybe where Xerox is in Webster? Pollution spot.
Industrial.
I see where I grew up. East Rochester. Let me show you a little bit more. How about now?
I can't read this straight.
you'll see like Ladder Road,
That's the west side.
Ridge Road West,
That's the west side, much less,
Rockport,
much less blue.
much less blue, a lot of white, right? Little pocket of green over here off of Ladder Road.
High density and urban and semi-urban. Parts.
Some of the towns, you're seeing a little more density.
And so there's the blue, and it's very blue
Very blue still, or white.
for what?
All right, turn and talk now. With the person next to you, what do you think these colors might mean? What patterns do you see? What do the roads do?
Circling and going in.
We gotta figure out a way to do this better. Sorry about that. Those are the hard ones. Oh, so you can see a little bit. Ready, okay. Did this be RIT over here, you're saying?
No, it's still, yes, yeah,
Oh,
it's
that's
in the
right.
south.
So right here.
But
New
there's-
bar
we're trying to
area.
figure out what the red is. The very bright red spot,
This right here,
yes.
Particular ethnic or religious.
this would be a religious group, an ethnic group. Is this U of R over here? Do folks notice 490 here,
Yeah.
right, in the airport, kind of that green and then immediate blue? It always sticks out, same with the inner loop. All right, you want to see the key?
Income,
Okay, so we got income. I heard demographics and density. What else could it be? Race. Pollution, I like that one. Rental versus home ownership. Any other thoughts? All right, so this is population. I'm not giving you the year. One blue dot is one white person, one green dot, one black person, one orange dot is one Asian person, and one red dot is one Asian person, and one orange dot is Hispanic. So what year is this? Feel free to call it out. What year do you think this is? 2023. 1968. My fourth graders often say Martin Luther King times. I'll be like, when is that? And they're like, the 1900s. And I'm like, oh, I feel so old. So this is 2010. US Census data in 2010. And what I invite you to do with the person next to you is just sort of turn and talk. What story does this tell you about Rochester in 2010? What questions come up? What story does this map tell, or what questions come up as you look at this? Feel free to talk to the person next to you. What does this make you think as you look at this map?
Where are these?
A lot of the student housing over there for U of R. There's a really high student population.
That's what
Also,
I was really shocked.
Henrietta has huge population. Yeah. And it has some of the most apartment complexes in itself. Henrietta was built last, or one of the last to be built. So can I point a couple things out?
Yeah.
So a couple things I think are interesting. Notice the railroad.
Yeah.
So I live right here in Beechwood, and I think it's interesting. East Avenue is separated by the railroad. It's all blue, right? And then the river. Same with the inner loop. It's kind of interesting how you have, people often call this the crescent, right? So the crescent of poverty is what it's often called. And I think the outer loop looks interesting to me with the suburbs. It's like a barrier. It's just something that stuck out to me. I heard folks say the word segregation. I heard, do people live where they, by people who look like them, right? A lot of thoughts kind of coming in there, a lot of questions. My students always ask me, why? How about you?
I would have thought it would have been some polling dots in the suburbs. I haven't seen anything.
It's a little hard to see. You'll see a lot more. There's some green mixed in Gates and Greeks. There's very little green mixed in the town like Penfield or Fairport, maybe in the one affordable housing complex, the Pines. And then you guys, when you come back here, you see Phillips Village. These are kind of the only two apartment areas that aren't like a high-end apartment. I think that's kind of interesting. Henrietta is one of our most diverse suburbs. What was that red hot spot? This is the Pines of Harrington. This right here. Yeah. Oh, so sorry. This right here is I'm trying to think. That's Mount Hope. So I think that's the housing closer to the hospital. U of R housing, Whipple Park, maybe.
Is the Pines of Carrington,
Is it subsidized?
It's subsidized housing. And it's about 50% white, which I think is interesting. It was built for folks who are aging in place in Fairport, but the law changed in '68 and made it illegal to keep it whites only. And so it got grandfathered, it got finished. So it became a very integrated space, similar to Phillips Village.
Is there several maps for the 2020? The 2020 census, or also earlier, so like 1960, when you had a lot of the ethnic
You know, I did
European
not pull.
communities in the city.
Yes, I think that would be really good to see. I can email you that map. I do have that map, and I'll be able to show you the ethnicities in a few minutes as we get a little farther into the slides. Okay. So a couple things for us to think about as we look at this. The other thing is 2020, I didn't include in this. It's about the same, but they expanded the different demographic groups on the census in a significant way that makes the individual dot map harder. So the dot map now shows one dot is 150 people. So it's a little less clear as this one, but not much has changed. So that's something for us just to kind of think about. A little bit more data. Out of all 50 states in the USA, the most segregating school district border divides Rochester from Penfield. So Penfield and Rochester schools is the most segregated border by race and class in all 50 states. As a whole, New York State has the most segregated schools in the entire country. When it comes to home ownership, Act Rochester shows us that 73% of white people own their own home in our region, compared to only 32% of Black and 35% of Hispanic and 55% of Asian. What are we noticing and wondering about some of these differences? What story does it tell that 1 in 2 Black children are living in poverty in our region, 40% of Hispanic children, but only 13% of white and Asian? When you look at where you're born, Common Ground Health has found that if you're born in Pittsford, you're expected to live 9 years longer than a child who grows up in the inner city of Rochester. So a 9-year life difference. How are we allowing this to happen in our community? And I want to invite you just to kind of check in, because at this moment, I look at that data and it makes me feel angry. I'm in that red zone. I also feel thankful for the chance to talk about this and that it's not hopeless what we're looking at. But I want to invite you just for yourself in your head, just kind of check in. How are you feeling? Because I do think there's a temptation to look at data like this and shut down and to feel hopeless, which is the opposite of what we're here for at church. But kind of keeping some of that in mind, knowing how you feel gives you power. And we're going to look at a lot of folks in our community who have been in that red zone or that blue zone, who are angry, sad, hopeless, and upset, but have come together and done something about it. So as we look at injustice today, I'm always going to pair it with stories of resistance. And to center us, I want to give us this quote from James Baldwin. He says that the purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself and to make his own decisions. And it's my hope that we'll do that as we dig a little deeper into some of this data. So again, what's prevented our community from being a welcoming place? How have people worked to build an inclusive Rochester? How can we be a part of doing that same thing? And to do this, I want to give us just a little bit of language. So the first term I want us to think about is racist policy. So any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. Policy includes written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, guidelines that govern people. For example, enslavement was the law in New York State until July 4th, 1827. Fitzhugh, the street that this church is on, was an enslaver. He enslaved several people in the city of Rochester, along with Nathaniel Rochester and Daniel Penfield. They could do that because the law allowed them to, right? So keeping that in mind, racist, I think of as an idea or an action. Again, language for you to consider. It's okay if you don't quite agree with how I'm framing some of these terms, but I wouldn't call Daniel Penfield or William Fitzhugh or Horatio Gates or Penfield racist, but I would definitely say that their actions were racist. You can draw your own conclusion about them. But again, believing and acting as if something is wrong or right, superior or inferior, better or worse about a racial group, when they chose to enslave Black people in this community, I would argue they demonstrated a racist action. And on the flip side, people in our community have always been anti-racist or taken anti-racist actions, believing and acting as if racial groups are equals and actively resisting racism. This is Austin Stewart, who just down the street from here on Main Street opened the first ever Black-owned business. Before that, he was enslaved in Sodus and then Bath. He escaped along Canandaigua Lake on the Underground Railroad and eventually opened his business right here in Rochester. He became very successful, but he also he had a station on the Underground Railroad right here in Rochester and worked very actively to end enslavement. And on July 4th, 1827, on the steps of City Hall, he gave the big speech that commenced the parade in Washington Square Park of freed enslaved people who were celebrating with their allies. And a little bit more of a modern example, Elizabeth Hampton, who regularly attended the Downtown United Presbyterian Church, I would argue also took anti-racist action. She lived in the Hanover houses where she organized the Hanover Tenant Union. When the city stopped funding repairs at the building, they protested, they picketed, they refused to pay rent. When her friends who were Black couldn't rent an apartment from a white landlord, they would go to that landlord's house in the suburbs and they would picket with signs saying, "Did you know your neighbor is a slumlord?" And they would organize all of that in the basement of the Downtown United Presbyterian Church, as well as Big Brothers and Big Sisters, which was founded by her and her friends right here in this building, which I think is a really cool piece of the story. Her son, Sam Hampton, did a beautiful documentary about her life, and I will include it in the email to you, Sally, so you can send it to whoever wants, but it's free and beautiful to watch. All right, so let's dig in a little bit. We've got some language to help us think about what we're going to look at it. Let's root ourselves in some of this history. So from 1910 to 1970, about 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North in something called the Great Migration. In 1910, there were only about 5,000 Black people that lived in the city of Rochester, almost no Asian folks, an incredibly small number of Puerto Ricans. But by 1970, we had over 35,000 Black folks living in this community. And as the late 60s and 70s moved on, a significant number of Puerto Ricans also moved here. And this had to do with a lot of things. World War II, World War I, the opening of jobs, some of those kinds of things, people coming up to pick fruit in Rochester's suburbs and rural areas. Many folks came from Sanford, Florida to pick fruit in Marion, Wayne County, Hilton, and Scottsville. And when they went to get an apartment in many of those towns or buy a home, they faced several barriers as people of color. And the first barrier was the Board of Realtors. This was our local board from this period of time, led by President Frank Drum, who enforced a code of ethics that was the national code for every part of the United States, but was actively enforced here. In fact, if you showed a home to a non-white person in a white neighborhood, you could lose your real estate license, according to their code of ethics. And when Howard Coles, our first Black realtor, and the editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper, showed a home to a Black couple in white neighborhoods in Rochester, like 19th Ward or Brighton, he was pushed out of the real estate market by this group of men. We do this training every month for realtors. It's been very interesting. But that was just one piece. And it didn't matter if you were not a fruit picker. Maybe you were an executive at Kodak, like Dr. Walter Cooper. He and his wife, Helen, were one of maybe 4 or 5 African-American employees in the 1950s who were allowed in at Kodak. And despite having PhDs, being upper middle class, they looked at ads for 69 apartments and were denied at every single one because of the color of their skin. The Coopers eventually found an apartment to sublet in the redlined Goodman Ave area of Beechwood from a Black family. It wasn't until then that they found a place. But Dr. Cooper, who had his young son at this exact same time, still finding joy in the face of the discrimination that was going on, he and his wife, Helen, they got angry. And when he's talked to my 4th graders, because he's still with us, he's on our advisory board and works with me and Keisha regularly to tell these stories. He said, I was angry and I harnessed that anger into taking action. And one of the first places he went was the banks. And when he got to the banks, he realized there was something bigger than just the realtors or even local banks. There was this national phenomenon going on called redlining. And I want to invite you to look at this map really quickly. Just take a look. I'm not going to have you share out too much for the sake of time, but I want to invite you to kind of just take a close peek here. You'll notice in the middle, a lot of red, right? Kind of like a red bullseye. We're kind of right down here in this shaded spot that meant kind of like downtown or industry businesses. This is the 19th Ward in blue. This is Gates in blue. You have the Erie Canal. Notice there's no major highways. You do have the railroad right here. You remember that from the other map? You'll see this is like Pittsford, Brighton, Cobb's Hill, Highland Park, Upper Monroe. This is Cornhill, Clarissa Street. Little Italy kind of area, Lyle Otis, Maplewood, Greece, Charlotte, West Irondequoit, and East Irondequoit. The white was undeveloped. So very few people live there, rural communities. Webster, where I grew up, it was a tiny little village. It didn't make the map, but it would have been green, those locations, if it had fit. So what do those colors mean? Green meant best. And again, notice this was a map made by the federal government as part of the New Deal under President Roosevelt in 1934. Green areas were rated best, blue desirable, yellow declining, and red meant hazardous. And this had to do with housing, with federal investment into mortgage insurance through the FHA and VA. Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, tells us that the government gave out mortgages to over 35 million families, over $119 billion between 1934 and 1968. And every mortgage had to fit with that map, but even more importantly, it had to follow the rules in the law's underwriting manual. So in order to receive a cut of that $119 billion, like my grandfather did in Greece in 1950, you had to meet these requirements. And here's what I'm going to invite you to do. As I read, I want you just to note in your mind any individual words or phrases that stick out. And I'm going to have you share with the group what words stick out, because it's going to be different for each of us. And I always think that's interesting. And when you read boring language, I think it's helpful to have something to focus on too. I can't help but be a teacher. So again, what do you notice about the rules that made a good and worthy government investment? Who and where? What do you notice? And again, this was the law until about 1968. Prediction may be made regarding the possibility of a location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in value. Natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and locations within from adverse influence, including the prevention of the infiltration of business and industrial use, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. A high-speed traffic artery or a wide street parkway may prevent the expansion of inharmonious uses to a location on the opposite side of the street. Before I go on, what word or phrase is sticking out to folks? Feel free just to call them out. Anything sticking out? I'll repeat. Invaded. Invaded. What else? Adverse. inharmonious racial groups, stability, infiltration, prediction. Based on what, right? Like just, I think a self-fulfilling prediction, that's important. Let's keep going. To be most effective, deed restrictions should be imposed on all land in the immediate environment of a subject location, with recommended restrictions that should include provisions for the following: the prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Quality and accessibility of schools. The social class of parents of children at a school will in many instances have direct bearing. Thus, physical surroundings of a neighborhood might be favorable and conducive to enjoyable and pleasant living in its location. However, if the children of people living in such an area are compelled to attend school, where the majority or a considerable number of pupils represents a far lower level of society or an incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist. What words or phrases stuck up now? Or feelings? Incompatible, undesirable, lower level, class, desirable, stable. So when I look at this, I'm starting to understand some of my family story, right? 1950, my grandfather bought a house in Greece. He couldn't afford it. When he went to the bank, they told him, you don't have enough money for your down payment. But because of this policy through the FHA, my grandfather qualified for an FHA mortgage that allowed him to buy this home, right? At a 30-year fixed interest rate, a home he could not have afforded without the government's help. Keisha James, who runs the project with me, also a teacher. Her grandfather's the same age as mine. Both were small business owners. Both worked really hard, but he could not buy a house until 1970. Instead, he rented a house off of Avenue D in a red line neighborhood. He eventually bought that house in 1970. He still lives there and it's worth about 40 grand on Zillow. My grandfather sold his house a few years ago in Greece. This is like his fourth house for well over $100,000. When my grandfather passed, we weren't rich, but I inherited a little money, right? So did my sister. He helped pay for my college. He helped pay for my mom's college, right? Again, we were middle class, but we had generational wealth, whereas Keisha has not inherited anything, right? And we often tell this story of how this is very much connected in some ways to this policy. And again, this is not my fault, but it's part of my story. And for me, informs why I share it and some of the work that I try to do in our community. Because some of these things that are going on have not always been talked about, and it was really shocking for me to learn some of it. So what do you notice about the men who made this law? They're all white men. A woman couldn't get a mortgage or a credit card until 1974. 1974. Where are these men from? I was taught the racists are only in the South when I was growing up in Webster schools. But that's Franklin Roosevelt from Hyde Park on Hudson, former governor of New York State, now president, and Senator Wagner. Yes.
So, sad fact is that all that lawmaking was based on social science.
The lawmaking of the 30s was based on the social science of the 20s in the Chicago school,
Yes.
where they talked about human ecology and who belongs where. And that's where that language of invasion and succession
Mhm.
from.
Frederick Babcock was the lead underwriter for the FHA. He wrote the book in 1924 on race-based mortgage assessment. As the Great Migration came to Chicago before many other northern cities, real estate men and bankers and mortgage assessors thought, we got to do something. And it perfectly coincided with what was going on with the study of eugenics at this period of time. And you'll see some of this right here. So take a look at the area descriptors. This is how Rochester neighborhoods were rated. You can actually go online and see every neighborhood. But notice the Plymouth Exchange neighborhood. It was 1% Black and 20% Italian and Irish, and that was deemed hazardous. Notice Gates, it was rated best because it was 0% Black 0% foreign and white collar, with newcomers of the same type. Look at Joseph Avenue, the 7th Ward area. Laborers and workers on relief, 40% foreign, Italian, and Hebrew, only 10% Black. I mean, that neighborhood's 90% Black and Hispanic today, right? Versus Meadowbrook, built by Eastman Kodak, businessmen and executives, 0% Black, 0% foreign. And so every neighborhood got this rating. And I want to point out Italians, Jewish, Irish were seen as lower. Being Catholic was not good in the world of eugenics, or being from an Eastern European country. And that changed in 1944. With Hitler and the Holocaust, eugenics starts to show its full ugly face to the world. And as Jewish and Italian people fought in that war, the GI Bill of 1944 legally made, at least in housing, Italians, Jewish, Polish people white, whereas Black folks who fought in World War II were still not white or full citizens and could not get a house and could legally be discriminated against in housing until 1968. This also had to do with Native American folks. Now, notice Syracuse. This is the Nedrow section. You'll see it was being infiltrated by half-breeds, is how literally the government language. So they rated it hazardous. Pretty significant. They talk about the Onondaga Indian Reservation bordering the area, also part of hazardous. So as you think of that eugenics movement, several churches right here in Rochester performed a Sunday school class on eugenics, teaching the science of the American Caucasian super race. The Hotel Rochester would regularly promote these things. George Eastman, who regularly put on blackface minstrel shows at Kodak with his executives, was one of the largest funders of the American Eugenics Society and supported this work. When he hired and brought in Dean Whipple to be the first dean of the University of Rochester Medical Center, he brought him in part because of the eugenics policies he'd been doing in California. The two of them would grizzly bear hunt together. I mean, they were close friends, and they had a strict policy into the late 40s that kept any non-white person out of the nursing or medical programs at the University of Rochester. Dr. Lunsford and Dr. Levy at the NAACP were instrumental in changing that. Even the Red Cross, built by Eastman, did not accept Black blood. They could not mingle Black people's blood and white people's blood. And Lunsford had 50 light-skinned friends in the 40s actually go there and pretend they were white. They donated the blood and it got mixed in. And he wrote a letter to the paper telling them how he'd done this prank. And it led to a national scandal and the Red Cross being integrated across the United States. And I mean, how many lives were saved because of this man right here in Rochester and the NAACP and those brave friends who risked something pretty significant to take that step? So when you look at these maps, right, you start to see some patterns from the redlining map to where people live today based on race or income, where the temperature is highest in our city, where the violence rates are highest, redline neighborhoods, where disinvestment and forced segregation has occurred. You'll see similar things with food insecurity, asthma, mental health issues, lack of insurance, high blood pressure. The list goes on, and these patterns continue in almost every major American city where these maps were made. But the maps, again, are not the most important thing. The language I read in the law was what you had to qualify and pass federal scrutiny before any FHA or VA loan was given. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really important. In 1958, the New York State Commission on Discrimination found that in the 7th and 3rd wards of Rochester, those redline neighborhoods, still 30% of homes didn't have running water. They found that was where 80% of all non-white people lived in Rochester, was just in those two neighborhoods. And again, I want to encourage you to learn more about this with our incredible film directed by Carvin Eisen called Home Access Denied that tells more of this story. And you can see it at the Little, but we don't have time for that today. So I want to do a quick pause before we take a look at how some people took action. Here's Dr. Cooper working at Kodak, doing science stuff, getting patents like he does. Dr. Cooper has often said to my students when they were upset about learning this history, because it's hard to learn about this kind of a thing and how close to home it is. And he says to them, I was angry. I was so angry at being denied mortgages at homes, but I realized I was doing it on my own, the fighting, just me and Helen. We needed to expand our community and do it together. He said, never give up. You're either involved or you're not. There's not a middle ground, and I choose to be involved. So he harnessed his anger. and he used it to build with his friends. And so he and his friends, and I actually think I screwed something up on my slides here. Hold on. But he and his friends, they went to every bank in town, Lincoln Alliance, Rochester Savings, First Federal, and he was denied a mortgage because of the color of his skin. So he got more organized. He found white and black friends at the NAACP and Puerto Rican friends, and they started working together, and they started building some power. So when he went to Eastman Savings and Loan, they were a little bit scared of him. And in Dr. Cooper's words, he says, they didn't want the trouble that would come from not giving me a mortgage. And so he was able to get the first mortgage in 1958 that a black person ever got from Eastman Savings and Loan. And a white realtor broke the code of ethics and sold him and Helen a home in Henrietta and 11 other of their friends. The DNC reported that there were 11 individual black people in 1960 living in Henrietta, making it the most integrated suburb of Rochester in 1960. The Puerto Rican Student Union, Puerto Ricans got real organized too, calling out how it wasn't just the housing disinvestment that came from redlining, it was also public works. The public works weren't picking up garbage, or the garbage trucks weren't coming down Joseph Avenue, but they always came on time in Browncroft and Merchants and Culver, those blue and green and yellow neighborhoods. So the youth called this out, writing letters to city council, calling this out and saying this was a systemic issue. It's just pretty impressive. I mean, people were taking action throughout our communities. People like Dr. Alice Holloway Young, the first black principal in Monroe County. She helped found Monroe Community College. She wanted more space for her kids to play. And so they tried to move into the 19th ward, but no realtor would show them a home and no bank would approve them for a mortgage because they were crossing that line, right? So she found Mrs. Harper Sibley at the Western Union Telegraph. She was like the heiress of that fortune. She lived in where Pastone is today on East Avenue. And she was part of the NAACP too. So she bought her a house that Dr. Young never got to go inside of, bought her the house and did a private mortgage under the table, lying on the paperwork and saying Dr. Young was her niece. The Youngs heard rumblings that this was not going to be welcome. So they moved in the middle of the night with a crib and a suitcase and their kids. The next morning, they found Ku Klux Klan members in their yard, fiery cross, racist letters with the N-word in their mailbox on a regular basis. But Dr. Young, who's given this talk with me a number of times, insists that whenever I tell this story, that I don't just highlight her and her husband James's courage, but also the one group of neighbors on the street. She says, I often have white people tell me that they say, oh, that was just the times, or, we didn't know any better back then. And she says, you do, because the Bushes knew better. They were the only white family on the street who came and stood on our porch with us. And together, the four of us told the KKK to get off our yard. And they backed down, the cowards that they were. And when I think about that, right? And I think about that story and that this is 10 years after my grandfather bought his house in Greece. It starts to hit a little bit different about our community, but also what change can look like. It can literally be as simple as saying, no, I'm going to go stand on your porch and I'm going to support you, even if no one else is. And now the 19th Ward is one of our most integrated neighborhoods. Or here's Dr. Martin Luther King at Charles Lunsford's house, the guy who integrated the Red Cross. This was the home that he unsuccessfully at first tried to integrate the 19th Ward Brighton area with. After getting petitions, he was able to make his way in. The other thing that was going on was something called racially restrictive covenants. In 2016, I went on Evan Dawson to talk about teaching redlining to my fourth graders. And someone called in and said, oh, there's whites only deeds called racial covenants on my house in Brighton. And my fourth graders could not believe it. And they insisted we research. So we talked to Adam Bello and then Jamie Romeo, partnered with Yale Law School, and started researching racial covenants on deeds on the microfilm. And I couldn't believe what we found. We found that Monroe County's government actually signed and voted to put whites only deeds on county-owned properties in Irondequoit and Gates. This one right here, you'll see the town of Gates signed it, Eastman Kodak signed it, ESL, Eastman Savings and Loan signed it. Pretty significant stuff. But they actually, in the legislative record, every county supervisor voted to put this whites-only deed that said no one of any race other than the Caucasian shall use or occupy any building or lot that were these county-owned homes. There's the Gates School Board who voted to put it on their school number 4, Hope Hall today. You'll see these in Webster. You'll see these in East Irondequoit. The Catholic Church, actually, their bishop signed his name on this covenant under St. James Church in Irondequoit. Walter Wegman, founder of Wegmans, leader of the Republican Party in Irondequoit, put this on his home and helped others do the same in the town of Irondequoit in the Somerville area. You'll see the Meadowbrook one in Brighton. Notice this one in Brighton actually included no Jewish, Black, or Italian people on these deeds. So it was pretty serious stuff. The head of the Real Estate and Builders Association, the head of the Bar Association, the president of RIT, the list goes on and on. Over 10,000 homes have these whites-only deeds, but always people of color fought back, like Judge Reuben Davis, who tried to integrate the 19th Ward, found a covenant on it. Nothnagel Realty enforced that whites-only deed. So we found a white friend at the NAACP to buy the house and sell it to him under the table. And he says we had to resort to devious methods like those in order to find housing. You can see the map on our website. This is every racial covenant that my students and I and our community have come together to find. We know there are more, but you'll see every single suburb and the city has these whites-only deeds. And many folks are starting to do something about this by crossing that off and adding a statement of welcome to all, like the Meadowbrook neighborhood in Brighton. When it comes to affordable housing, there were whites-only affordable housing like Ferndale and Ramona Park. You can see Mayor Dicker and Elmer Milliman at Central Trust Bank. Notice what neighborhood public housing was built in. It was built in that Empire area, a blue neighborhood. Hanover houses, where Elizabeth Hampton lived and organized, was supposed to be by Franklin High School, which was a 100% white neighborhood. But over 1,200 folks came out to protest in the early 1950s when the state officials came to dig the shovel in for the affordable housing complex, because the neighbors did not want Black folks in their neighborhood. They actually spit in the faces of the state officials. And Councilman Nagel moved the project and got it right into the redlined Joseph Avenue area. And so this is where the story gets interesting. So like Elizabeth Hampton moves in to the Hanover houses, which quickly became incredibly overcrowded, 13 families sharing 3 bedrooms. You know, all kinds of things are going on in these 7-story towers. People couldn't get out. Elizabeth Hampton, you can see pictured there. My understanding is this is a picture from your church where she and her friends were organizing. They would go and picket at the landlords' houses in the suburbs when they wouldn't rent or sell to Black folks. So they started taking all kinds of action. They organized things like Rochester Community Involvement, which became Big Brothers, Big Sisters, again, right out of this building, which I think is so cool. Just that space was welcome, and people in this church supported and helped. Another piece of this story is that people of color in these redline neighborhoods were not just living lives of sadness. People came together and found joy in their churches and their jazz clubs like the Pythod, Shep's Paradise, Dan's Tavern, Valet's Tavern, and integrated spaces where people didn't lock their doors and felt safe. All kinds of things like that were going on. Because if you did make it out of those neighborhoods and sent your kids to a suburban school and somehow overcame the redlining or the covenants, you would face blackface minstrel shows. This is 1960, Honeyway Falls Elementary School. Teachers and students putting on a spectacular minstrel show, as the paper called it. This is RCSD, some of the white schools like School 44. This is Greece School District, Kodak, and Newark, Aquinas, Allendale. Every single school, even the Locust Club, would put on blackface shows. Henrietta schools. And as always, people of color fought back. Reverend Primo has started a letter writing campaign with Flora Harris and Hannah Storrs at the NAACP, calling out that this was explicit racist indoctrination and that it needed to stop. And they got these shows out of schools by 1968. And meanwhile, you can see the segregation happening. We don't have time to dig too much into this part. Justin Murphy's book on school segregation in Rochester is incredible. But again, people like James Beard and his friends organized and fought back. The last thing I want to talk about before we close is how redlining's evolved. In 1968, redlining and racial covenants became illegal. You could not say, I won't sell you a home because you're Black. But you could say, I won't sell you a home because of your source of income, which continues to be legal today. You could say, I'm going to make it illegal to build apartments in Penfield through zoning. And that's what started to happen in every major suburb across the United States. When you could no longer segregate legally on race, people started to segregate based on class and some significant issues. The town of Penfield actually admitted that racial bias was a factor in their zoning change. You can see it in the town board minutes in that community. So they've made it illegal to build a duplex in most of our suburbs, or even an accessory dwelling unit like this one is illegal in most of our towns. Joe Wilson at Xerox actually partnered with the NAACP with Robert Rhodes, who integrated Pittsford, and publicly called the zoning in Greece and Pittsford, they called together it racist, saying this is the new racial covenants. But they lost those battles. And today we have some of the most segregated communities and schools in our country, right? The Race Commission has tried to resurrect this after the killing of Daniel Prude. One of their big recommendations is that the city and county and suburban towns need to change their zoning policy. We're not talking about building seven-story complexes in the suburbs. We're talking about duplexes, small apartment buildings where you could actually have real integration in our communities. A refugee from Nepal named Benita, she went to Mercy High School. She found our curriculum online. They weren't teaching our curriculum. And she started to learn this history by herself and reached out because she saw in her town new apartments were being built at Marketplace Mall that wouldn't allow families like hers, but only elderly folks. So she worked with us, folks at Empire Justice, and here she is with 15 of her friends speaking to the Henrietta Town Board, and she actually successfully changed the zoning code at the Marketplace Mall apartments. And so if a high school senior can do something like this, if a group of 9-year-olds in my classroom can see systemic racism in hiring and meet with the principal and then meet with a school board and superintendent and change our hiring policy from not just putting Henrietta welcomes you on the website, but actually going to historically Black colleges in Georgia and recruiting, doubling the number of Black teachers. Again, if a group of 9-year-olds and 18-year-olds can have this kind of courage to show up to a town board meeting at 7:30, how much more can folks in this room? And so as I kind of close, I want to bring us back to those main questions. What's prevented our community from being welcoming and affirming? We learned about redlining, racial covenants, blackface shows, zoning, all kinds of things, the real estate board. But we also learned about how people have built an inclusive community, from Dr. Young and her friend Harper Sibley, from the Bushes and Dr. Young fighting the KKK, to Benita and her friends in Henrietta, to Kaliyat and her friends in Rush, Henrietta, to Robert Rhodes and Joe Wilson, the president of Xerox and a Black engineer, coming together to challenge what was happening. We don't always win, but like Dr. Cooper always says, you never give up, either involved or you're not, and I choose to be involved. And I want to really thank you for this chance to share some of these stories with you all today. And I'll open up in our last minute for any questions. And I know we got to go to church after that. So thank you. Really appreciate it, everybody.
Have you done this presentation to any school board committees like Penfield School District?
We have never done it in Penfield School District. They're one of 4 districts that we aren't working with, but we would love to. We've done it in Spencerport, Hilton. A number of districts have had us speak to their school boards, but not that one. But if you know someone, we will come. It's 100% free and grant funded to have us work with any school or community group, and we would love to do it.
Do you have a list of the school districts that aren't?
The districts that have chosen not to work with us at this time, again, we will work with anyone, are Honeyway Falls, Pittsford, Penfield, and Churchville. We will work with anyone though, and would love to. And everyone's in a different place. There's different things going on, but we're here whenever they're ready with free professional development, support, curriculum, and training to do this work. So the way we've gotten into 16 of the local districts, though, is someone like you who knows someone who's invited us to come. So we would absolutely love it.
Anybody can go to a school board meeting. What was that?
They absolutely can. And we would encourage you to do that if you so choose. Thank you. I know it's time for church, and I'm excited to join you all. But I really want to thank you. I'll hang out and answer questions. And I'll make sure I have my card, if folks want to get in touch, would love to talk with anybody more. But again, thank you so much for having me. And there is a flyer for our free event at the Little with July 64 and our film on racial covenants, Home Access Denied. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. It's wonderful. Every time I hear you speak, I learn something new because I believe that he puts in new things. So if you had him speak somewhere else, he probably would research where you are and put a little history in of that.
We always do.
That's
Yep.
awesome part of this. And I want to invite you to the next two Sunday forums next week and the Sunday after that on the 24th that are also being co-hosted by the DEIB committee. Next week will be Kathy Castagna from Opening Doors. And she's going to talk about the programs that they offer. And then the next week we will have Gwen Olton from the Gandhi Center. And that will be an awesome presentation as well. So thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your Sunday.